Hello and welcome everyone to our first program of 2026. So maybe I should start by saying happy belated New Year to everyone. And our first guest of 2026 is the eminent historian, Professor Haggai Ehrlich, is a professor who has written many books in relation to Ethiopia and Eritrea. And he has been on our show, I think twice, maybe three times before. And we are happy that you have joined us today, Professor. Welcome to Tugat.
Yeah, thank you, Teklai. Let me say in advance that I'm quite an old person. My memory is not as clear as it used to be. And I spent the last year writing a book on Yemen. And now I'm busy writing a book about the Somalis. So if I forget details and so on, and my memory would not serve me that right, bear with me.
I think our viewers will excuse you, so there is no pressure, no problem there. But actually, I do remember we had this conversation in perhaps last conversation where you said that your memory wasn't up to scratch and all that. But actually, the impression I had was you had a photographic memory. As I was so impressed with your ability to recall even details, even minor facts of events and all that. So I think you have an amazing memory. So I am not in the slightest worried about that. But if it happens that you don't forget details and facts, by all means, we totally understand that. All right. No pressure. Feel at home. So the purpose of this conversation, Professor, is to try to give historical context to what is relevant in Ethiopia and Eritrea today in terms of politics. The two countries have been at loggerheads, I think it's fair to say, for the past 2 or 3 years following the Tigray war. And just to give you the two extremes, the Ethiopian regime tends to say that Eritrea is not a legitimate country, that the way it became a country in 1993 wasn't correct, that it was a historical mistake to let Eritrea become an independent country. That is what you tend to hear from representatives of the Ethiopian government, whereas Eritreans tend to say that Eritrea has always historically been independent, if not independent, distinct from Ethiopia. And throughout this conversation, we're going to try to find what the truth is between these extreme claims. So maybe we could begin. Maybe we could go back to the times before the Italian colonization of Eritrea. What the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea was then, before Italy came to the scene. What was it like? Did Eritreans see themselves then as distinct from Ethiopia, or was it not?
Well, history is not a judge. History is a sequence of facts that the historian, the professional historian, the one with integrity, is trying to reconstruct, to shed light on past events. And everyone can judge from his own view how to evaluate this. Does it justify today's argument or it does not? This is not up to the historian. My job, my profession, is to delve into the past and try to not to reinvent, but to discover, and using the best of my judgment and integrity to unearth the sequence of events. And this is what I'm trying to do. By the way, as a principle, I'm not going to touch, when I write and when I study, today's ideas. There are many who hold their views, and that's okay. My contribution is to try to understand past events, reconstruct the sequence, and so on. First of all, as for your question, the word Eritrea didn't exist on the geographical, historical map prior to 1890. When the Italians established the colony of Eritrea in that year, they went back to Latin and from the word Mare Eritreum, namely the Red Sea, they invented or came forward with the colony of Eritrea. By the way, trying to show ancient roots to what they just created. But if you look at nearly all the countries of Africa and many of Asia, they didn't exist prior to European intervention, and mainly even the scramble for Africa in the 1880s, and then in the Middle East after the First World War. The word Iraq didn't exist as the name of a country. Iraq means the rocks. As you look from the Arab Peninsula to the valley of the Mesopotamia, you called it Iraq, but it was prior to 1920. It didn't exist. Or Jordan was never on the map as Jordan prior to 1920. And not to mention African states that their name was carved by the imperialism and today somewhat changed, and the boundaries, all that's an invention of either Western imperialism and modern local nationalism. As for Eritrea, prior to 1890, you can go back to the days of the Aksumite Empire, the early modern form of Ethiopia. It was the center of gravity of the whole region. That was an entity that the capital was Aksum, but the port in the Red Sea was Adulis, today Zula, in Eritrea. So Eritreans of today can argue that the empire of Aksum was the first form of modern Eritrea. And the Ethiopians can argue, no, that's the Aksumite empire, that's the root of historical Ethiopia. And either side can have a case in that point. But as for the facts, after the demise of the Aksumite Empire, in the 10th century or so, the center of gravity of Ethiopia moved to the south, the Zagwe dynasty, the Solomonian dynasty, then so on. And what was beyond the river Mareb, they call it Mareb Belash, or sometimes the land of the sea, Bahar Nagash. It was not really an integral part of the empire, it was the periphery of the empire. Also, again, from today's point of view, when the Italians established modern Eritrea in 1890, they annexed into the new colony nearly everything that is today the Muslim population of Eritrea. The Banu Amr and the Sauta and the Habab and all the rest. Prior to that, it was just areas that the Ethiopians used to raid, not to control. So modern Eritrean nationalists, they had also their own internal arguments about that. What is Eritrea? I suppose we shall come to that. What is Eritrea? There was a phase in which they thought Eritrea is an Islamic Arab country. And the Christians said, no, 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 it was part of historical Eritrea. And today Eritrea, I would say that is Eritrean. It's neither an Arab country nor an African Ethiopian country. It's Eritrea per itself. The way I see it, as from 1991 or 1993, the way it was declared independent and under the leadership of Isaias Afwerki, it's Eritrean. It derives from the past. What is convenient for them, the Ethiopians can argue and be right about it, that it was also always an extension of Ethiopian culture, Tigrinya speakers, Christian Ethiopians, and so on. So you can take from history whatever you want. And my profession is to bring the history to the knowledge and the conscience of those who are now making history. They can make history as according to their interest, their inclination. But I feel that what I need to do is to present as best as I can. What is the past? What is history? Let me also add, someone once uttered the following sentence, which I think is very wise. There is no such thing as history. There are historians. What happened in the past disappeared, evaporated. It doesn't exist. I, as an historian, reconstruct it, and what I will do, it will be the past. So I feel very much responsible in my effort to write the best scholarly history I can do. Not to promote any cause, this others will do, that I produce. But try to recreate history in the best of my judgment and integrity.
Well, you say that you can take from history whatever you want, and indeed that is what is happening now in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government is selectively remembering and sometimes misrepresenting historical events that it thinks would help it advance its today's politics, and the same is happening from the Eritrean side, to put it maybe a little bit cynically, and the reason why I actually think having you on is always interesting for our listeners and viewers is because the assumption that the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean government and the Ethiopian and the Eritrean have when they selectively summon historical events to support their current politics, the assumption is that the people don't quite understand history. That is the past is one big darkness, and we're trying to shed some light into this darkness so people could see what the historical context is. And at the end of the day, I am not even sure how much role history should have in today's politics, because at the end of the day, like you said, Eritrea today is Eritrea, regardless of how it came into being. But I believe that it is it is of paramount importance that people understand history, so that when people make grand claims about historical events, people could make up their minds about that. So that is the context within which I think this conversation is always fascinating and important. So we started before the before the Italians came to what is today's Eritrea. And the reason I started there is because later I want to ask you about what effect and impact the Eritrean colonization has had on the Eritrean sense of being and identity. I'll come to that.
The Italian colonization. You said
Yes.
before.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for the correction. But if you could dwell on a little bit on that time before 1890, when people like Johannes and Alula were operating in today's Eritrea, were they seen as foreigners, as people who came from Ethiopia among people who lived in today's Eritrea, or were they considered as what as among the people?
So let's go beyond the Johannes and Halula. What is today the Christian island of Eritrea, the regions of
Hamasen,
Hamasen, Saraya, Keleguzai.
Saraya, Kaloguzai, yes.
It's beyond the river Mareb.
Yep, Maramulash.
Self-consciously, those people, before the Italians came and annexed the Islamic tribal society, so to speak, they were part of Ethiopia, but for many centuries, quite autonomous. They were if you go to early 19th century and on, the Hazega and Sazega, there were families who controlled Hamasen, and the head of the last important family, Ras Wolda Mikael, maybe the most important figure in today's Eritrean consciousness. He was speaking Tigrinya. He belonged to the world of Tigrinya speakers. Of course, he was a Christian, and he was very much fighter for the autonomy of Hamasen in this area, not in the name of modern nationalism. He never heard the word Eritrea, but he was for this region maintaining its autonomy. And when Johannes came, 1872, he coronated himself in Aksum in order to revive the old concept of the Aksumite ancient empire. He sort of annexed Hamasen, Saraya, Keleguzai to the kingdom. He moved the old center of gravity of Ethiopia to the north, and he summoned Wolda Mikael to the ceremony, and he also swore his allegiance to Johannes, and for all intents and purposes it was part of renewed Ethiopia under Tigrian hegemony in Aksum. But then Johannes appointed the young ambitious Ras Alula. At the time he was still a Shazaka, but the person who later in 1884 established Asmara to administer the whole region, which was contested by the Egyptians. Later on, the Sudanese Mahdists and the Italians. It was the area in which the independence of Ethiopia was to be guarded. And Johannes trusted Alula. And Alula undermined the autonomy of Ras Wolda Mikael. It's a very long story, we're not going to delve into it. He sort of tricked him and betrayed him and sent him in chains to Johannes, and he finished on the top of Amba Salama as a prisoner. And this story is it's a formative for today's Eritreans, that they were independent, and Alula, in the name of Ethiopian imperialism, ended this autonomy and committed other crimes against the local Eritreans. In fact, he brought his own people from Tigray, established Asmara, and tried to control and modernize it at the expense of the locals. And you can go into this formative story and see the two sides. For today's Eritreans, Ras Wolder Michael is the innocent father of Eritreanism that was robbed and tricked by the colonialist Ethiopians, and for the Ethiopians, that was the way to defend Ethiopia. Ras Wolder Michael, by the way, collaborated with the Egyptians against Ioannis. That was the point in which Alula began undermining him. So you can take it either way. But the sequence of events is that Alula tried to modernize Eritrea as Ethiopians, establish Asmara, roughly in the same year, a bit same time, that Menelik established Addis Ababa, and Ras Makonnen conquered Harar in the name of Menelik, and Ioannis never really modernized Tigray. Alula wanted to modernize Eritrea, or the Mareb Melach still. And Ras Wolder Michael would not cooperate with that, so he betrayed him and besieged him to Ioannis. You can take the story from every angle. But at the time it was still not Eritrea. It was Hamassen. If you want, culturally, historically, the continuation of the Aksumite Empire, inhabited by Christians, Ethiopian, speaking Tigrinya. So when I wrote that story, I didn't know and I didn't care about whose cause it will serve. This is the story as it happened. No one is very much righteous. They all trick each other. You can take Ras Wolder Michael and said he collaborated with the Egyptians who wanted to capture the whole country. And Alula, a great Ethiopian patriot, but you can take it the other way around. The people of Hamassen, Sarai, Akela Guzai, they had their own autonomy. There came those Ethiopians from Tigray. They eliminated the local elite and brought their people, and it was like colonizations, like the Italians. You can take it to any direction you would like to pursue your interests.
Well, indeed, as you say, we could leave the historical reconstruction to today's politicians in Tigray, in Ethiopia, and in Eritrea. And maybe just to give one example, in Tigray, for instance, the historiography or the reconstruction of history is that Hamassen were to Alula and to Ioannis, Hamassen and generally the Mareb Melach, they thought it as much of their own as they considered Adwa and Tambien. There wasn't any distinction as far as they were concerned, which was why they were ready to put their lives on the line, defending those areas. That would be the view you get from Tigrayan politicians of today, whereas Eritrean politicians of today, especially those affiliated with the regime, would tend to say that Alula was an invader and that he brutalized people like Wolder Michael, as you say, and the other noblemen in the area, and that he was pretty much an outsider. And as you said, a continuation of Ethiopia's tendency to colonize and brutalize Eritrea. That is how the historiography is as far as current Eritrea's politics is concerned. But I'm not trying to get you into the politics. I'm trying to get you to give out the facts so that good faith people of good faith could make up their own minds as well. So that is the purpose. So that is before Italy colonized Eritrea. So I think one thing that our viewers would really want to understand in terms of Eritrea and the colonization is what was the impact of Italy's colonialism on the Eritrean sense of being, of identity and sensibilities, and how people see themselves. What was the impact of that? I think it was 50 years colonialism.
Yeah.
Of course, there is the obvious one, which is the economic development. I think Eritrea was relatively more developed than Ethiopia by the time Italy left in 1941. But other than that, what was the impact?
Well, not too much. The period of Italian control of Eritrea can be divided into the period of so-called liberal imperialism up to Mussolini, and from Mussolini onward. The Italians never, of course, they established Asmara, made it little Rome. I was first in Asmara in 1971, as if I visited Italy. It was marvelous. But for the Italians, Asmara, Eritrea, they wanted to compensate themselves for losing manpower to America. People were emigrating from Italy to America. They wanted to have their own colony so they would not lose that population. Very soon they understood that it's not much of a great place economically, and they really didn't invest that much in Eritrea, nor did they invest much in Somalia. And then came Mussolini, and for him Eritrea was a cornerstone for the future great empire, that he will revive the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean and Ethiopia. For them it was they called it the African colony. And Mussolini, of course, not before, the liberal imperialists wanted to control the whole of Ethiopia, but they lost in Adwa. And Mussolini wanted a revenge not only for the sake of sport, he wanted to control Ethiopia. And when he did, after 1936, he renamed the whole region, including Eritrea, Italian East Africa. And carved again the region of Eritrea out of the sixth region of the Italian East Africa, what was called Eritrea, it included Tigray. Tigray was in the same as Eritrea, and for them it was an Africa. For the Italians, Eritrea in itself didn't mean much more than a springboard to control the Horn of Africa, which they did up between 1936 and 1941, under Mussolini and the war he launched on Ethiopia. Then after the loss, the British came in 1941. The British who kicked out the fascists, the Italians, and liberated Ethiopia, first of all, they restored the sovereignty over Ethiopia to Haile Selassie. But as for Eritrea, under Brigadier Longrig, the military governor of Eritrea, their idea was to divide Eritrea. The Muslim population, they would re-annex to Sudan. And the Christian population would be a sort of a buffer zone between them and Haile Selassie, over whom they wanted to control indirectly only. And the British, unlike the Italians, they were better involved in local affairs, and what they did from our perspective today is to politicize the diversity of Ethiopia. They established parliament, elections, and the United Nations, after it was 1945, took upon itself to promote politicization of Ethiopia towards independence. And then, with British encouragement, there was established a Muslim League and the Unionist Party and the Liberal
Progressive Party, Liberal
Party, and other political bodies. They argued between themselves, what is the future of Eritrea? The Muslim League were for creating an Islamic Eritrea combined to the Arab world, and the Liberal Progressive Party were trying to pursue the notion of independent Eritrea, and the Mahabar Party, the Unionist Party, wanted to re-annex to Ethiopia. So the argument of what is Ethiopia, it goes from the beginning of the modern history until today. And then came the autonomy under United Nations auspices, which was a Swiss federation in an African empire. A very difficult marriage. And there the story became much more aggressive. As you know, Haile Selassie in 1952 annexed Eritrea, just a province of Ethiopia. And the Muslims of Eritrea took some time, the Eritrean Liberation Front, which until its demise in the mid-80s, argued for the Arabization of Eritrea. It's part of an Arab world. Actively supported by the idea at the time in the 60s, 70s, that the Arab world is going to unite to become the center of a big all-Arab revolution. And in the Arab maps of that time, Eritrea was part of the Arab world. And the slogan of the time of the ELF, it was headquartered in Cairo, and the great ideologue was Osman Saleh Sabi from Massawa, who wrote History of Eritrea, by the way, History of Eritrea, ignoring Ethiopia. And the whole idea is Eritrea Arab, or is Eritrea part of Ethiopia? Or does it have an identity of itself? It's a long story, but the issue that we are pursuing in this meeting about the identity of Eritrea, it was all the time. And at the end, between the Eritreans and themselves, at the time that was the war with Haile Selassie, and the war in nearby Yemen, and the Nasserite revolution in the Middle East, and the Israeli involvement, and all that, at the end, it was the struggle between the ELF, Eritrean Liberation Front, that stood for the Arabization of Eritrea, and the EPLF, that stood for the independence of an Eritrea. And the brutality of Haile Selassie, and later on the more so of Mengistu, helped the cause of the EPLF. The Arab option was defeated. After the 6-day war in the Middle East, the whole idea that there will be a unifying Arab revolution, victorious and so on, evaporated. And the brutality of Mengistu pushed the Christians Eritreans into the arms of the EPLF to control Eritrea. Because Ethiopia was identified with the brutality of Haile Selassie and later on more so of Mengistu. And the story during those years evolved into the victory of Eritrea. And then went on the whole idea of the Liberation Front. It was born in the Arab world. The ELF was born on the model of the FLN in Algeria, and then the Liberation Front in the Arab world. And the model was nearly the same. The importance of the idea that you connect with the people and form armed groups and peasant association and all that. It was in itself a big and important revolution in the history of the whole of the Horn of Africa, the importing of the Liberation Front from the Arab world. But the first one was an ELF, was for Arab Eritrea. But then, because Mengistu, especially, and Haile Selassie prior to that, pushed the Christian Eritreans into the arms of the EPLF, the idea of an Eritrea won the day, until today in Eritrea. Look, Eritrea from 1890, you can take it the Italian period, the British period, until 1952, the annexation by Haile Selassie, for 60-something years, the Eritreans experience European imperialism. And a byproduct of that was quite a high standard of political awareness and organization. In Eritrea, especially under the British, were already trade unions and political parties and a parliament and constitution and a flag, and people were divided around ideas and so on. I myself, I was first time in Ethiopia in 1970. Under Haile Selassie, it was like a medieval Solomonian kingdom, no political party, no nothing, only the divine emperor. And to marry the Eritreans, future Eritreans or whatever, the Eritreans, that enjoyed quite a high standard of political awareness, to become the subjects of this biblical emperor, and later on the Stalinist dictator Mengistu. So you can understand why the Eritreans stick to their Eritreanism. And then they go to history and evaluate it and judge it and learn it according to the idea that we want in future to be Eritreans, not to be part of Ethiopia. So you go back to Ras Alula and the massacre on the Baria and the tricking of Ras Michael, and you give it the flavor of the wrong past to be the basis of a future. As a person who follow, by the way, I was first introduced to the Horn of Africa in 1970 when I went to London to pursue my PhD. Prior to that, I didn't know anything on that. And they told me, Willendorf, professor, why don't you write about Ras Alula? I said, it's a good idea, and I ran home to find out who is it. And I introduced myself very quickly to Ethiopian Eritrean affairs. But at that time, in the 1970s, the idea of an independent Eritrea was the darling of global intelligentsia. There you have people who build their movement and they want to become democratic and connected to the world and liberal and so on. While Ethiopia was medieval Haile Selassie and then the brutal Stalinist Mengistu. And I myself, I thought, okay, I'm a liberal person, I want to see people progress. But now we are in 2026. You look back and you say that you're deeply disappointed. The great promise that was Eritrea was shattered. Paradoxically, Ethiopia opened more to the world, especially under Meles Zenawi, but later on. And Eritrea became, under the dictator of Isaias Afewerki, something happened to him. I will tell you a story about that. Something happened to him that instead of being the great modernizer of developing Eritrea, he became a producer, the greater producer of refugees. I want to tell you a little story.
That's a tragedy. Tell us the story of Isaias Afewerki.
In 1993, look, those episodes, sometimes they are very much important historically. In 1993, as the new leader of independent Ethiopia, he made a tour in Eritrea.
Independent Eritrea.
He made a tour in Eritrea, and in western Eritrea, in the lowland, he contracted malaria. And he came back to Asmara nearly dead. The Israeli ambassador in Addis, Chaim Divon, heard about it, and he arranged for an American plane to take Isaias to Israel. And my good friend, Professor Eli Schwartz, arguably the greatest expert on tropical diseases in the world, received him in a Sheba hospital, and he told me the blood of Isaias was already black. So I hospitalized him for a few months, and slowly, I took care of him until he recovered. And then he invited me. I'm talking Eli Schwartz.
Your friend, yes.
He invited me to Asmara, and I was made a hero of Eritrea, and they all... But slowly, I understood that I'm not invited anymore. And 2-3 years ago, I interviewed Eli Schwartz, and I told him, look, something happened to this Isaias. For the hero in the bush of the revolutionaries, the fighter with sandals and so on, he became an absolute dictator. I asked him, I permit myself to ask, does it have anything to do with the malaria that he contracted? He said, I cannot be a judge of that. But something, in such cases, do something to the brain. That's what he said. Historically, medically, is it true or not true? We cannot judge. But the great hope that the EPLF used to be, liberation of women, the liberation of peasants, and I tell you, in the 70s, 80s, everyone of open mind was standing for the future Eritrea. A few years ago, during the war on Badame, you remember 1998-20, the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia? I was invited to Addis Ababa University to speak about it. There were 2,000 students, and I said, look, Eritrea deserves credit for introducing the whole ideas of liberation front, of liberating peasants and women and so on, as it used to be. And the liberation front in Ethiopia that kicked out Mengistu, they were all modeled on the EPLF. I talked to Meles about that. He didn't like the idea, but that was the fact. The TPLF was born in Asmara by the EPLF. There were students from Addis Ababa, they went to Asmara, and the EPLF people...
So Meles wasn't at all impressed that you told him that story, the story of how the whole idea of revolution.
Meles didn't like the idea. My presentation that the TPLF was born in the arms of the EPLF. He was a very proud person. Very open-minded. I was very much impressed by him. Not only me. President Clinton, to distinguish from me, President Clinton said, this is the model of a hope for the whole of Africa, Meles Zenawi. He read everything. He knew everything. He was very strong-minded and very much an intellectual. But in 2012 he died. I met him a year before. He was still sound and healthy, and he told me, we had hours of conversations. He told me, I want to be like you. He was telling me, I want to be an historian. I got enough politics, I want to be an observer of history. And I told him, excuse me, you are a maker of history, not an observer. Never mind. But he was very, but at that point, he wouldn't accept the idea. But as a matter of fact, historically, the whole revolution in Eritrea of borrowing the concept of the liberation front, first by the Muslims, the ELF, and then the Christian, the EPLF, that was the beginning of modernization of politics in the whole Horn of Africa. Then you had the TPLF and the Afar Liberation Front and the Roma Liberation Front and so on, that mobilized Ethiopian periphery to defeat Mengistu. Sometimes history works in paradoxical way. Ethiopia under Haile Selassie and Mengistu was a dictatorial, centralist, brutal system. At the time that Eritrea seemed to open to its own diversity and to the world, and then things changed back. I'm not talking about today's Ethiopia. At the time, Ethiopia, like 10 years ago, developed very, very quickly, opened up, seemed to be a future of a very progressive state and society. And then about today, I don't know. I know, but let's put it aside. There is a tragedy of both Ethiopia and Eritrea. By the way, maybe it's because of my age or what I see around. I'm quite disappointed at what's happening in Israel, but that's outside our scope. And as a historian of Arab Middle Eastern societies, I'm very much also disappointed. I was a student at the time, and I studied my Middle Eastern studies at the time where there was a great hope of the Arab world. Future unity, future progress, create a new society, and a rational, scholarly people will lead us, and so on and so on. And then everything collapsed, and the Arab world sunk into dictatorship and so on, as it is today. It comes along with my age, you can become pessimistic in age, but not me. No, I'm still optimistic. Things will be better in the future.
But it's very interesting that the last point you make about how you have become pessimistic with age. I think if we could kind of abstract away now from Ethiopia and Eritrea and just view the whole region. I think people should listen to people like you because you have written a lot on the Horn of Africa, on Yemen, on Israel, on the Arab world. And I think your views and the things that you have written about the region should be given more credibility and people should listen to you. I have always wondered why it is that part of the world has always been unstable. And I think there is a lot of wisdom in what you say and what you write. And maybe it's about time that people listened to you. If we could make a bit of a digression in that respect. But you mentioned Medles and how impressive you found him. I think it was easy for Medles to impress people. It helped that he was a reader. He understood a lot of things and he knew how to relate stories and all that. So that was something that came easy for him. I think, but also as you say in the example, in his refusal to accept something that he knew to be reality, because his refusal tells you that he was very ideological and very rigid in some respect, which was also maybe his final undoing in terms of the system he created. He was very, very rigid, and that rigidity was reflected in the system, which eventually came apart, I think. But there was another thing that I was really fascinated by actually in your book, where you I might be misremembering, but in the struggle for Eritrea, where you write, even the revolution that toppled Haile Selassie actually got its momentum in Eritrea. And that is something that I didn't know. I of course knew that the TPLF got a lot of support from the PLF, and all the momentum to Tigray came from that and all that. So that wasn't new. But what was new to me was the revolution. The Derg revolution was also kind of inspired by a lot of things that happened in Eritrea. I think that is a little known fact. But again, if I could take you back to the 1950s, after the end of the British administration, and when you said that the effect of the British administration was to politicize Eritrean society, which was why there were many parties: the Unionist Party, the LPP, Liberal Progressive Party, and the other kind of Muslim affiliated parties. The reason I asked you what were the impact of the Italian occupation was I wanted to understand why, for instance, why was it that the people in the LPP, for instance, thought independent was good for Eritrea? Why did they end up having this mentality of wanting to become independent? Was that the effect of the colonization, or was it something that was always bound to happen anyway? If I don't know if I have articulated myself well.
If you are a political word person, say in Asmara in the good old days.
In the 1950s and 60s, yeah.
Yeah. So there was the idea at the time, it seemed victorious, of an Arab Eritrea. The Ba'ath party in Syria gave the ideology, and the Nasserite people in Egypt gave the power, and they seemed to have their tomorrow as a victorious entity. But you, I'm not talking about you personally, as a Christian Tigrayan speaking Tigrinya in Asmara, you are not an Arab. You didn't want to be an Arab. By the way, also the people of the Banu Amr and Sauta and Habab, neither they were Arab. But it seemed that the Arab victory at the time would annex everything. You better follow this trend, become part of the victorious uniting Arab world. But then it was defeated. The other option of yours to become part of Ethiopia is also a very, very bad option for someone who became an independent-minded person under the British, and you have your profession, and you have your mind, and you had your parliament, and so on, to become an obedient person of a medieval entity like in the days of Haile Selassie. You didn't want to belong to this Ethiopia. Didn't want to be like, surely, to Mengistu's Ethiopia. In my book, The Struggle Over Eritrea, I mentioned, I interviewed, some of them were my seniors, advisors in Eritrea, in the second division of the Ethiopian army, and they saw in their Israeli eyes of today what the Ethiopians are doing in Eritrea at the time. They said they are not going, no chance. They will win Eritrea with their brutality, and no chance that the Eritreans will follow them. But that was a period of great hope. Let me give you, enlarge the picture. I grew up in the late 40s, 1950s, in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was also a period of great expectations over the whole world. After beating the Nazis and creating the United Nations, but then the world sank into the Cold War, and what Europe did to itself at the time, it's more brutally than the Horn of Africa was doing to its own people. What Europe did to my people. So today's time, and going back to the point of pessimism, I compare today's period to what used to be in the first half of the 20th century in Europe, or in the Horn of Africa during the imperialist and the Haile Selassie days, and so on. People, infants died in the first year. Today, we are really in a period of very quick changes all over, but still, as President Obama said in one of his speeches, it's still the best period in human history today, with all the abilities. I still hope and think, as realistically as I can, that the best is yet to come. Also in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, the potentiality is there. Let me go back a bit to Meles Zenawi. You're right that he had his ways with Europeans in new languages. He was very bright and very impressive. And I had my arguments with him, by the way. I allowed myself. He was 14 years younger than me and read all my books, and he gave me the impression that I can argue with him. We had a very, very serious argument. I told him, you have to appease the Amhara. You have to allow Haile Selassie become the historical figure he deserved. Allow a state funeral for Haile Selassie. He would not. It was very emotionally anti-Amhara, and that was, by the way, his biggest mistake, retrospectively. But, on the whole, history is what people do, not what people say, or not justice or anything. He left Ethiopia, with the great hope of the great Ethiopian Renaissance then. That was the thing. I studied about that and wrote about it. That was the way for Ethiopia and the whole Horn of Africa to start on the path of real modernization. The potentiality of the Nile, the World Bank in the year 2000, before it all started, said that it is the #1 resource of Ethiopia. And he personally, initiated the whole thing, and today you have a dam there, with all the potentiality of electricity and irrigation and what have you. That today they don't fulfill this potential and still argue and still there and quarrel with Egypt instead of rebuilding. That's a big, big story. But talking about Meles, he did it. All the emperors of Ethiopia prior to him, Mengistu only thought that he will build something to punish Egypt, not to... But he didn't do anything. Haile Selassie was speaking and did nothing. And Menelik agreed with the British that he would not interfere with the waters of the Nile. And Johannes didn't even build one city in Tigray. If you go back, talking about the Nile, 1,000 years. But the man who said, okay, we do it with our own resources, and the dam is already there, it's Meles. I'm far from being a lawyer or an advocate of anything. I'm trying to understand the complexity of the past and of persons. But according to my judgment, Meles was a great hope.
Well, I mean, I think that the problem, whatever the merits and demerits of Meles were, the people who succeeded him are infinitely worse. You're trying to avoid commenting on current affairs, but I would leave it at that. You made an interesting point, which is that despite all the doom and gloom and all the negative news and all that, this is actually a good time. And that kind of chimes in with what the philosopher Steven Pinker, I don't know if you have read any of his books. I think in one of his books, in the Better Angels of Our Time or something, he makes the case that life is progressively getting better and better, despite what you might be tempted to believe by what you see. So he has statistics and data and everything, and he shows you actually that everything is getting better and better. But I wonder if that is the case in Ethiopia and in Eritrea, and maybe this is a kind of a segue to my final point. I think the fear and worry that people in Eritrea and Ethiopia have is that the countries might go to war anytime. There is a lot of saber rattling from Ethiopia now about port access. Ethiopian politicians are saying that the Assab port and Massawa port have historically belonged to Ethiopia in the past, and that it is time now that Ethiopia got them back. That's what they say, and the Eritreans would say, well, Eritrea has always been a distinct country, and the ports have always belonged to Ethiopia, and it's illegitimate for Ethiopia to want to claim these ports. And I'm not going to ask you to pass judgment on these claims and counterclaims, but as a historian, when you listen to those kind of things, how do you read it?
Well, I studied history. You take Massawa that you just mentioned, the port of Massawa. It always belonged to the greater sphere of the Red Sea. Jonathan Miran wrote Red Sea Citizens, story of Massawa. It never really belonged to Christian Ethiopia. It was oriented towards Egypt, to the Red Sea, In 1884, Admiral Hewitt, a British officer, made an agreement with Johannes in the name of Egypt. There was an Egyptian also in the delegation, which is a British organizing. June 1884, my memory is still good, June 1884, the Hewitt Treaty, or the Adwa Treaty, because it was signed in Adwa between Johannes and the British, and Mason Bay, another British who was, so to speak, a delegate, an Egyptian official, in which Johannes undertook to relieve the besieged Ethiopians from the hands of the Mahdiya, the Sudan, and Ethiopia will gain Hamassen more, so to speak, Bogos country at the time. And in Massawa, they will add an access to port services run by the British. Even at the time when the whole situation was argued, the Ethiopians didn't bother to take Massawa. By the way, in 1879, Alula said to the French consul there, "I will not rest until my horse drank from the Red Sea." Only someone who never been near the sea can say a thing like that the horse will drink from the sea. But then the British sort of out-tricked the Johannes and brought the Italians in. And the Italians started penetrating into the inland, and that's all led to the Massawa, to the Adwa battle and so on. But never in history, as much as I know, I said before, during the Aksumite period, Aksum was the capital, and Adulis, today's Zula, 50-60 kilometers down south of Massawa, was the port. But at the time, Ethiopia, Aksumite period, was a Red Sea entity, even controlled Yemen, Abra, so to speak. But after that, Ethiopia shifted to the south and never aspired to a port. It was landlocked. Another episode that comes to mind, the British all the time wanted a dam on Lake Tana to irrigate the whole Nile basin. And they were nagging Menelik, but later on, more important, Haile Selassie, to let them build a dam at Lake Tana on the Blue Nile. And Haile Selassie had his good reasons to refuse. He said, once the British will be in Ethiopia, they will never leave. But the British offered him, once they build the dam, free electricity for Ethiopia forever, so and so million sterling a year, and a port in Zayla, British Somaliland at the time. Haile Selassie refused. You can philosophize. If the British were in, Mussolini would never dare to attack Ethiopia, and the whole history will be different, and modernization of Ethiopia will be different. But this is the kind of, historians can only speak about.
That's a counterfactual difficult to gauge how it would have turned out. Yes.
Yeah. We can, over coffee, we can fantasize everything. But the fact of the matter was that Haile Selassie didn't want to have a port in Zayla. And going back to Johannes and the port in Massawa. To add port access services and so on in Djibouti, and that's another matter. So you can take history and speak about it the way we speak, and they can make out of it whatever you want. If you want now for Ethiopia to modernize by having a Red Sea port or an Indian Ocean port, you can go back to history and say so and so.
Well, I find it fascinating that you say many Ethiopian rulers didn't quite want to have a port. They didn't really push for it, and maybe that applies to.
A famous saying, I like to quote it by Gibbon, 18th century British historian philosopher, that was talking about Ethiopia. He didn't know what is Ethiopia, he knew the concept, and he said a very famous quote. Encompassed on all sides by the enemies of the religion, the Ethiopians slept 1,000 years, forgetful of the world by which they were forgotten. Ethiopia, the land of Pastor John, was a landlocked, legendary Christian entity over there. And the way I can judge by its history, Ethiopians were comfort in not being involved in world affairs, knowing for sure that once they interfere in the world will come to them. And the better safeguard their uniqueness and independence and so on. So access to the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean and so on was never an Ethiopian strategy.
Well, that quote is something that many Ethiopians invoke actually when they try to grapple with why Ethiopia is a poor country, despite in the past having a great civilization. So it's good that you reminded people of that quote. But just one more point, because you made an interesting point that Ethiopian rulers have always been complacent when it comes to the port.
Last point. Mm-hmm. Last one. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say whether that applies to Meles as well, and whether that is something that he mentioned to you in your conversations with him, because many Ethiopians today will tell you that if Meles had wanted Ethiopia to have access to the port, that he would have secured it, and that the reason Ethiopia ended up being landlocked was because Meles didn't quite want to have port, or it didn't bother to go to the great pains and length that it would have required him to go to. So I wonder if you have some thoughts and reflections on that, but otherwise continue with your story.
No, Meles wanted to be he wanted to be a man of the world. He began as a Stalinist when he was still in the Marxist-Leninist League of Tigray and all that, very much naive Marxist. He wanted to build Ethiopia on the model of Albania at the time. But then the more he learned, he developed into a man of the free world, interfering with the Nile. He mobilized African diplomacy to face Egypt, but he wanted through them to connect to Egypt and the great world. To have a port at the time, first of all, he understood that he should better get along with Eritrea. In 1991, he initiated the Federation of Ethiopia. He recognized the right of Eritrea to become independent. Not that he had another option. He couldn't fight Eritrea at the time. And Somalia at the time was under Siad Barre, and it was a sovereign state. In 2006, if I'm wrong, Ethiopian army under Meles invaded Mogadishu to get rid of the Shabab and the radical Muslims. But then he pulled back. I don't think that he wanted to disconnect from the world and remain the old Ethiopia, forgetful of the world and be forgotten. No. Neither did Haile Selassie. They knew the big world. But as always, they were very much cautious. Haile Selassie had his lesson. That once the Europeans are there, the big lesson was, of course, Mussolini. But also the British. He didn't want them to build a dam at Lake Tana, with all the promises that they made. To conclude, I still go back to the issue of pessimism and optimism. We are now really living in one big world. And history is very much flexible and changing in a quicker pace. And dictators would collapse. I hope so, I think so. The revolution of free information. Let me conclude with the following. I look at my profession. When I started as an advanced student at the Hebrew University, and then in London University for my MA and doctorate, the way we were collecting material at the time. It's a story of Ras Alula. The British archives at the time, and the Italian archives, and the French, and in the field in Addis Ababa and Adwa, I had to write down everything. To get basic information, you have to spend days, and if you're lucky, you get something, and then you have to write it. The revolution that the craft of an historian underwent during those 60 years that I am in business. Today I sit at my desk and I have all the information coming. An ocean of information is coming to me. And the way I can develop ideas and communicate with fellow, like you are in Stockholm, no? I am in Tel Aviv, we are talking face to face. It's big developments all over. And I believe the freedom that it carries, it serves the liberals much more than it used to serve the dictators at the time. And also the lesson of history as you go generally into it is that freedom and liberalism and democracies are stronger. Good point to conclude, no? Like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, just to give context, I mean, you wrote your dissertation, your PhD dissertation, what, 50 years ago now? So that, yeah, a little longer, all right.
yeah,
And
55.
55. So in 55 years, it's a tremendous amount of things have changed, and it's amazing how fast things change. And maybe, as you say, I think you have a very optimistic view, and maybe in the long sweep of history, everything would be for the better. And that's a good antidote to what you today hear constantly, which is that might is right, and sometimes it appears as though the world is on the brink of some kind of nuclear war or something like that. So I would rather hear more of your optimism than the other very debilitating thought. But thank you, Professor. You started this by raising concern about your memory. But if that was real concern, it has been thoroughly allayed. I think there is no problem in your memory. Your memory is as sharp as it has ever been, I think. And we wish you health and long life. We always appreciate you coming on here and teaching us about Ethiopian, Eritrean history and the Horn of Africa. And doubtless, we will want to have you on more. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Tekla. It was a pleasure. Best to everyone. See you.